Human rights are not a privilege granted by the few. They are a liberty entitled to all. And human rights, by definition, include the rights of all humans, those in the dawn of life, the dusk of life, or the shadows of life. Representative Kay Granger. Human rights are being violated in Bahrain. These include torture, killing without grounds, arresting and detaining people without just cause. While the United States has made small stands here and there, it has not set forth a clear policy for the sale of conventional arms to Bahrain. What the Affirmative Team's plan does is set forth a clear path by which Bahrain can receive weapons. For these reasons, the Affirmative Team stands firmly resolved. The United States federal government should reform its policy for the sale of conventional arms to one or more of the following: Taiwan, Bahrain, or Egypt. Observation 1. Definitions. The following two definitions come from Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. Sale: the exchange of goods, services, or property for money. Human rights: rights as freedom from unlawful imprisonment, torture, and execution, regarded as belonging fundamentally to all persons. The following definition comes from the Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms, U.S. Department of Defense. Conventional weapon: a weapon which is neither nuclear, biological, nor chemical. Observation 2. The goals. Both goals come from the Presidential Policy Directive 27, submitted January 15, 2014. Goal 1. Ensuring that arms transfers do not contribute to human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law. Goal 2. Promoting regional stability, peaceful conflict resolution, and arms control. Observation 3. The plan. Both mandates are addressing U.S. policy towards Bahrain. Mandate 1. Establish an arms sales cap of $160 million to Bahrain, adjusted for inflation. Mandate 2. Limit the amount of arms that are sold based around the currently violated articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Explanation. $20 million will be approved as Bahrain reforms its human rights violations. The result is a constantly fluctuating amount of sale. Let's say 1 year Bahrain violates 4 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That year, Bahrain would get $60 million out of weapons. An article will be considered met when there are less than 10 violations per year. Enforcement, normal means through the Department of State, Agency, Department of State, Department of Defense, and Department of Commerce. Funding, normal means. Addendum. The Affirmative Team reserves the right to expand and clarify upon this plan as needed. Observation 4. The advantages. Advantage 1. The United States will encourage human rights reform. Unique. Arms sales can and should be used as leverage. This article is all about how to solve the human rights issue in Bahrain. How to bring stability to Bahrain, Human Rights First, February 2015. The White House and Defense Department should withhold further arms sales and transfers to the police and military contingent on human rights progress. Impact. The Affirmative Team's plan will help save lives. Changes need to be made, and they will reduce human rights violations in Bahrain. Human Rights Watch, U.S. Stop Proposed Arms Sales to Bahrain, September 22, 2011. In mid-February, on the 10th anniversary of King Hamad al Khalifa's major political reform proposal and following uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, Bahrainis took to streets in massive numbers, demanding democratic reform. The government initially responded by opening fire on peaceful protesters, killing 7 and wounding hundreds. In mid-March, after several weeks of continuing protests, the government declared a state of national safety. Solvency. Clear milestones are the best way to encourage reform. A new U.S. approach to Gulf security, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, February 2014. When conditionality is attached to FMS, U.S. officials should communicate clear milestones for reform that are understood by both the partner government and the Office of Security Cooperation personnel charged with managing FMS and interacting with local military officials on a daily basis. Advantage 2. Peace and stability will be improved. Unique. Peace and stability will be improved because of the absence of human rights abuses. Killing the Messenger, Bahrain's brutal crackdown, Freedom House, November 8, 2011. The idea that stability and U.S. interests are best secured by providing unwavering support for oppressive monarchies has proven false and short-sighted, given the recent uprisings in the Middle East. The United States should advance its interests and values by being a strategic ally of the Bahraini people and supporting moderates and reformers, rather than unconditionally backing a brutal regime. Impact. U.S. interests in Bahrain will be more secure. In Bahrain, an uprising unabated, foreign policy in focus, May 20, 2013. Several analysts, including the Director of National Intelligence, who recently raised concerns regarding the increasing instability in Bahrain. If the situation continues to deteriorate, Bahrain may no longer be a viable location to host the Fifth Fleet. Solvency. Reforms are the best way to improve stability. March 10, 2014, open letter to the President of the United States, co-signed by 28 researchers representing over a dozen organizations. Real and lasting stability in Bahrain can only be achieved through genuine reform. The people of Bahrain have made it clear that their legitimate democratic demands for reform will not go away and must be addressed with solutions. The United States possesses a special obligation to pursue stability in the country by promoting reform that meets these demands. Reform and stability can coexist, and the United States must demonstrate the leadership needed to realize that model in the Gulf. In conclusion, putting an arms sales cap on Bahrain would be in the United States' best interest to help secure Bahrain and rid the burden of human rights violations from the United States. And with that, I am now open for cross-examination and further clarification.
In that speech, did you cite any numbers for the human rights violations that have happened in this past year?
No, I did not.
Okay, did you cite any numbers for the human rights violations that have happened at all?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. Your goal one was that U.S. arms cannot contribute to human rights violations, correct?
Our goal one is ensuring that arms transfers not contribute to human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law.
Okay, so pretty much that we can't sell any weapons that would hurt the human rights of the citizens of that country? It would be a good summary? Okay, thank you. Has anyone ever set a cap on Bahrain money-wise before?
What they did in 2011 was a little bit different than what we're doing in our plan. What they did before was that they took some arms away, but that is not what we're doing in our plan.
Okay, was there ever a cap set? Where did you get your inflation adjusted?
I don't believe there was.
Okay, did you state in your mandate that you had an inflation-adjusted
Yes,
cap?
the cap will be adjusted for inflation.
Oh, okay, got it.
Sorry.
All right. Under your mandate 2, where do you find the Universal Declaration of Rights?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, my partner can expand more on this, but it's a standard that the U.S. is meant to follow and that other countries, it's a standard for countries to try to achieve.
Okay, and how exactly are you reforming it? Or reforming our policy with it?
What we're doing is we're making it so that we're limiting the amount of arms that are sold based around the articles violated. And right now there's 8 articles being violated. And
okay, so you are limiting arms as long as those articles are violated.
We're, as we keep, as Bahrain is reforming, we will start sending them arms again.
Okay, thank you. Did you list any percent of how much the human rights will be, or the human rights violations, beg pardon, will be reduced with your plan?
I did not give a percentage, no.
Okay, thank you. Is there any impact in the status quo of hurt stability, or is it just a possibility?
There is impact.
What is that impact?
That impact is that, sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Yes, is there an impact in the status quo, or is it just a future possibility?
What we're doing is we're trying to achieve that possibility.
Right, but is there an impact on the United States right now because we have not set this cap?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Currently in the status quo, the United States must balance its arms sales policy to Bahrain with the issue of human rights, but also the important issue of the country's importance to the United States and the strategic goals that we work on. Human rights are vitally important to the United States and something that we must support. That is something that is currently recognized in the status quo. Moving forward, as we make any policies that change our arms sales, we have to determine, does it cause any hurt to the strategic importance and strategic relationship between Bahrain and the United States? That's the important question we need to keep in mind as we look at the details of this plan. So let's start off, first of all, with the goals of the affirmative team. Now, the affirmative team has two main goals in this debate round: to ensure that arms transfers do not contribute to human rights violations, and then to promote regional stability with Bahrain. Now let's talk about, first of all, how the current system is actually meeting both of these goals better than the affirmative team's plan. First of all, with the first goal of ensuring that our arms transfers do not contribute to human rights violations, let's look at some evidence from Kenneth Katzman from the Congressional Research Service, published February 14th, 2014. He says, quote, "The unrest has caused the administration to put on hold sales to Bahrain equipment that could easily be used against protesters, primarily equipment provided to the Interior Ministry, while genuinely continuing to provide equipment that is suited to Bahrain's external defense capabilities," unquote. So the United States federal government recognized the importance of maintaining and upholding human rights. So they cut off arms sales to Bahrain that would directly contribute to human rights violations. That's the goal of the affirmative team, and the status quo is currently meeting this. Under the plan, we'll see how their plan is actually not better meeting this, but harming it through a significant disadvantage. Now, their second goal, that of regional stability. Again, under this point, we already have regional stability by being a strong presence in Bahrain. Now, the United States and their strategic relationship provides the security, peace, and stability to Bahrain that they need. By reducing or limiting and placing a cap on the arms sales unnecessarily is not going to increase the peace and stability of the region, but would actually provide a disadvantage. And again, we'll see that under the disadvantage. Now, before we move forward into the rest of the plan, my partner and I would like to provide a counter goal that we believe is important for the affirmative team to meet when considering arms sales policy. This is from the U.S. Department of State in their U.S. relations with Bahrain from September of 2013. It says, quote, "To protect and advance U.S. interests, the United States uses all tools available, including foreign assistance, to make Bahrain a stronger and more interoperable partner for regional peace, security, and counterterrorism operation." Now, this goal is bigger in scope than the goals provided by the affirmative team and includes all our policy with Bahrain. So this is our overall policy, but it's also critical because it deals with the strategic relationship that we have with Bahrain and doesn't just narrow into specific partnerships that we have with them. This is something that's important, and currently in the status quo, we're meeting that. We're providing Bahrain with weapons that they can use in external defense. We're providing them with weapons that they can use to help us in our interests in the area. With the affirmative team's plan, we're severely limiting the number of weapons they can buy by placing a cap on them. This goal will be severely hurt by the affirmative team's plan and not better met than it is in the status quo. So let's move into the specifics of this plan. Now, before we get into the actual mandates, we have no significant numbers on human rights violations. We're just aware that there are some, but there are human rights violations in every country. There are currently some in the United States. So we don't know the significance or if this is even a big enough issue to warrant the change that the affirmative team is providing. Now, let's start off with the mandate one, that they're going to establish an arms sales cap of $160 million. Now, first of all, this arm cap is unnecessary because currently in the status quo, human rights are vitally important, and the United States has amended their policy to deal with them. We are no longer selling them weapons that can be directly used in human rights violations. That's the first thing. So this is not necessary. Now, let's look at this cap one more time. The act of cutting or limiting the weapons that can be used in human rights violations is something that must be renewed annually. Now, under the affirmative team's plan, they do not say that they will renew it, and the cap does not limit what weapons they can buy. It just limits the amount of weapons they can buy. Under this point, the affirmative team is allowing them to buy $160 million worth of weapons. They can buy $160 million worth of weapons that can be directly used in crowd control or in human rights violations. They do not specify the kind of weapons that can be used or can be bought with this cap. So this mandate is instead not helping their plan, but only hindering it. Now let's move into the second mandate, that they're limiting the arms based on human rights violations. Now the United States is already doing that without creating significant disadvantages by strictly limiting it. The United States is only cutting back the sale of arms that is directly used in human rights violations. They're maintaining those that can be used for external defense, for counterterrorism efforts, for the defense of Bahrain as a country. This is important to note. We should not limit external defense weapons that cannot be used for human rights violations simply based on human rights violations when we're cutting the arms that can be used in human rights violations. So these two mandates don't better meet the goals of the status quo because they're not actually addressing human rights or peace and stability in the region. So this brings us to the advantages presented by the affirmative team in this debate round. The first advantage is that they are going to be encouraging human rights to perform. However, this is not the case. By only setting a cap but not limiting the weapons that can be bought, they are simply encouraging, they're allowing weapons to be bought that can impact these human rights violations. This is not any better or preventing preventing human rights violations in any manner. Now, the second advantage, that of peace and stability, will be improved. Again, we're limiting we're limiting Bahrain's defensive capabilities. We're limiting their counterterrorism efforts. And we as the United States are withdrawing some of our influence by removing ourselves partially from the region, by limiting our impact in Bahrain. This too is significant as the United States plays an important role in Bahrain. So this advantage is not actually better. And there's no significant lack of stability now. Now, as a comparative advantage case, they don't have to prove that there's significant lack, but they have to prove that it will be significantly better. However, it's currently better with the status quo because we're maintaining our positive relations with the country and our strategic relations with the country in the best way possible. Now, if we do pass the affirmative team's plan, not only will we not better meet the goals presented both by the affirmative and negative team, but we're going to be provided with a significant disadvantage in this debate round if the plan is passed, and that is going to be, it hurts Bahrain. Now, currently Bahrain's human rights violations are being taken care of by the United States. We're stating our displeasure with them, but we're going to be hurting Bahrain by limiting their defense. And we're also going to be hurting them by opening them up from an attack by Iran. Now, this sounds very extreme, but Iran has been threatening them. Now, let's look at some evidence about this. This is from Habib Toumi from June 2012. He says, quote, in a statement to the Fars News Agency on Saturday, Karazi, the former ambassador in Paris, said that it was easy for Iran to occupy Bahrain. Quote, if Iran wanted, it could take control of Bahrain in a few hours by using its rapid reaction forces, unquote, he said, quoted by the Iranian agency. So we see from this source of evidence that not only has Iran been attacking, but it's a very real threat to Bahrain, and by limiting their defense, we're only going to be opening them up for an even greater attack. So why change the status quo when the goals are better met by the current policies? Thank you.
Under your counter goal, where does this goal come from again?
It comes from the U.S. Department of State.
Okay. How important is this goal? How is it more important than the affirmative team's goals?
Yeah, definitely. Well, this goal is more important because it's the overall policy of the United States towards Bahrain and any action they take. It doesn't limit it to either human rights violations or just peace and stability. It talks about our overall policy as we work with Bahrain.
Okay, and under our first goal, what arms did the U.S. stop trading with Bahrain? What specific arms?
You know what, let me pull up the evidence. It's tear gas, small arms, light weapons, ammunition, or other items for crowd control purposes or foreign security forces that use excessive force.
Did you read that evidence in your speech?
You know, I did not read that evidence, but I'd be happy to finish it for you. It's from the same gentleman and same article I read in my speech.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. Now, moving on. Under our second mandate, how specifically is this not meeting the goals?
Your second mandate isn't meeting the goals. Oh, because it's actually not going to be increasing, or it's not going to be ensuring that arms transfer policies don't contribute to human rights violations. I mean, you are strictly limiting it, but it's not going to be better meeting it because it's also hurting the regional stability. Your second goal. It's your second goal that it mainly doesn't meet, and that's the one of regional stability because you're actually be opening it up for greater instability and less peace in the region.
Thank you. Under your what was your argument under our first advantage?
Under your first advantage, that of, the United States will not be better encouraging human rights reform because it's not going to be any better because you're not preventing human rights violations or Bahrain from buying these weapons in any way.
Okay. Under your disadvantage, how are we, okay, sorry, never mind. Under our first mandate, did you read any evidence under your argument under our first mandate about the cap?
Not in the speech, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, no further questions.
Thank you.
Critics say the fact that Saturday's list includes the names of well-known Sunni and Shia Muslim families indicates that the move is not solely directed at eradicating long-running unrest among Bahrain's Shia Muslim majority. They say that it is instead an attempt by the ruling Al Khalifa family to remove all opposition to its extensive authority in the micro-kingdom. This comes from Bahrain ruler revoked citizenship of 72 nationals on security grounds, BahrainNews.net, January 31st, 2015. The negative team asked the affirmative team to bring up evidence of specifically stating numbers of human rights violations. And this is simply one instance where 72 individuals had their citizenship revoked under so-called security reasons. But in reality, there's no reason for this to happen. Now, before I get into the arguments presented by the negative team, there's a couple of issues with the negative team's arguments as a whole. The first is that the only evidence read by the negative team occurred in the goals and the disadvantage, along with one introductory piece of evidence. There's this thing in debate theory called the Burden of Rejoinder. And what this is that the negative team has to prove every single one of its points with evidence. Otherwise, there's no reason to believe that the affirmative team's plan would not be passed. This Burden of Rejoinder needs to be fulfilled by the negative team for its claims to be substantiated. Now we will move into the arguments presented by the negative team and see why the affirmative team's plan is still the best course of action. First, under the goals. Under Goal 1, the negative team argued that the United States is withholding some arms sales. But in fact, this is not true. According to How to Bring Stability to Bahrain, Human Rights First, February 2015. The United States continues to train the Bahrain Defense Force and provide around 90% of its equipment. The United States is still selling 90% of the equipment to these forces, and as of 2015. The United States is still selling arms to this area that is committing human rights violations, and in large quantities. This shows how the affirmative team's plan is actually still, how the status quo is not withholding these arms sales. Under the second goal, that the stability exists in the status quo. First of all, there's no evidence read under here about how stability is currently in the status quo. And as was read in the first affirmative constructive, and I'll repeat the piece of evidence, there is stability needs to be dependent on human rights violations. According to open letter to the United States, the President of the United States, co-signed by 28 researchers representing over a dozen organizations, March 10, 2014, published by Freedom House. Real and lasting stability in Bahrain can only be achieved through genuine reform. So this stability requires a human rights reform, which is not happening under the status quo. Now, under the counter goal, it is not really clear. First of all, the negative team has brought up no evidence about how this counter goal would not be met under the affirmative team's plan. They simply claim that it wouldn't. Or the negative team has not shown through evidence why this counter goal is actually more significant than the affirmative team's goals presented in the first affirmative constructive. With these, until this has been presented, the affirmative team does not accept this counter goal. Now, due to the similarity of the arguments between the goals and the advantages, in this speech I will be merging the two together and addressing them as one. Because the argument of the first advantage was that the main argument was that we are withholding arms sales. And this is basically the same argument as the first goal. The other issue the negative team brought up was that under the mandates, Bahrain can buy whatever weapons it would like. Now, they're missing a very significant piece. There's that in our first affirmative constructive, an article will be considered met when there are less than 10 violations per year. So it is true that Bahrain could buy any weapon under the affirmative team's plan, but it needs to have enacted reforms. So for the first article that it comes into accordance with, making Bahrain at 7 articles violated, they would start to receive $20 million worth of arms. And this would continue to increase as Bahrain starts reforming from year to year. But if Bahrain used those weapons to increase the human rights violations again, it would go back down because they'd be violating more than just those 10 violations per year. That is one of the nice parts about the affirmative team's plan, is that it creates this constantly fluctuating. It means that Bahrain will get more arms the more it reforms, and less arms the worse it does. Now, under the second advantage was basically more linked to the counter goal than really the second goal, but is that Bahrain will not have defensive capabilities, specifically from Iran. Now, there's actually this thing called the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and the Fifth Fleet helps Bahrain in keeping its security. According to Iran Goes Ballistic, Middle East Quarterly, winter 2015 issue, Bahrain's security is guaranteed by the presence of U.S. forces, most importantly the Navy's Fifth Fleet that is headquartered there. So even though Bahrain would not be getting these weapons for a short period of time until it reformed, the Fifth Fleet would still be there to help protect Bahrain during the short duration where Bahrain is not reforming. Now, with this address, we'll move into the mandates. I addressed the first issue the negative team brought up under the mandates, being that there's no numbers on human rights violations, in my introductory piece of evidence. There's just one example from this year of how Bahrain revoked 72 citizens' right to be in that country. This is a very important, significant issue. These 72 people basically had their right to live in that country ripped away from them. We don't know where they are now and how they're suffering from this. Now, moving into the specific mandates of the affirmative team, something I'd like to point out is that their primary argument under the first mandate was that this arms cap sale is unnecessary, and they reference back to the argument under the first goal and the first advantage. They're arguing the issue of the United States withholding some arms sales under 3 separate points of the affirmative team's plan. So all this is grouped together. And now the other issue was that they can buy whatever they want and use them for human rights violations. But as I just said, this constantly fluctuating web will make this a very beneficial system, because as Bahrain reforms, it gets more. Now, under the second mandate, they basically just said that we're already doing this under the status quo. So really, most of the arguments under the mandates, the goals, and the advantages is one argument. Mind you, with very little evidence. Now, at the end of the speech, we'll move into the disadvantage, and that it hurts Bahrain. Now, the main issue, or impact, you could say, of the negative team brought up was that Iran can attack. But the fact is that Bahrain does not actually need the weapons to defend itself from Iran. First of all, the Fifth Fleet is there to help protect it. But second, as of 2013, there's no evidence that Iran is actually working to do this. According to Talking About Reform in Bahrain, Brookings Institute, Geneva Abdo, April 10th, 2013. To date, there is no evidence, at least based upon public information and my own research of the country, that Iran is working to topple the Bahraini government. Thank you, and now stay open for cross-examination and further clarification.
Starting under your first goal, can you provide me with the source of the evidence that you read under it?
Just clarifying, this was the evidence talking about how we're still providing weapons to Bahrain?
It was the first one you read under goal 1. I believe it was dealing with the U.S. is not withholding any arms?
Yes.
Can I have the source?
This is from Human Rights First, February of this year.
February this year, okay. And did it mention a number of 90%, or were there any numbers in that evidence?
The 90% was the number that was brought up in this evidence.
Okay, so we're selling 90% of the weapons we used to sell, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, you're moving into the evidence under Goal 2. You mentioned that reform is necessary for peace and stability, is that correct?
The evidence that I stated under there said that stability is only really achieved through genuine reform.
Through genuine reform. Okay, and did it talk about reform based on human rights violations, or did it mention human rights violations at all?
That's the specific portion I read did not. However, the general context of the evidence was talking about human rights reform.
Okay, can you give me the title of the article of the evidence?
Yes, one moment. You could just clarify, this was, what exactly was this evidence talking about?
This was the evidence talking about only real and lasting reform can come about, or peace and stability can only come about with.
Yes. You wanted the source from this?
The title of the article.
The title was simply, it's an open letter to the President of the United States, co-signed by 28 researchers representing over a dozen organizations. Would you like me to read the organizations?
No, not all 28, that's okay. Moving into the plan, will you ever sell less than $160 million of arms sales to Bahrain, or will it always be at least $160 million?
It will only be $160 million of arms if Bahrain somehow manages to come into complete accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay, and this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where does that come from? Is that from the United Nations?
Yes, that is a official policy placed forth by the United Nations.
Okay, and does Bahrain have to meet all, I believe there are 27, is that correct?
There are 30 articles.
Oh, there are 30? Do they have to meet all 30?
Under the Affirmative Team's plan, according to the United Nations.
Under the Affirmative Team's plan.
They're not required to achieve complete accordance. However, complete accordance is always encouraged.
Okay, now the $160 million, that cap is unconditional, correct? Like, that will always be the cap. They can never buy more than that. Is that correct?
No. The adjusted for inflation part, sort of, I guess.
Okay,
the
so
160 million, it will stay the same, but as inflation happens, it will change around a little bit.
Okay, so we'd have to have a complete U.S. policy change to ever sell more than that. Is that correct?
We would, but Bahrain has not, in the past 20 years, to my knowledge, bought anything more than 140 million.
Okay, great. Now, who determines if Bahrain is making improvements or has improved under your plan in order to gain their money?
Under the normal means, there are two main parties, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry and the State Department. Both help certify this lack of human rights abuses.
Thank you.
The U.S., no matter where they sell conventional arms, has to weigh the benefit with the cost. And that is what the status quo is doing. In the status quo, we are selling weapons that Bahrain can use for their defense without selling weapons that they can use against their citizens. That is why the status quo is answering the goals presented by the affirmative team and the counter goal presented by the negative team best. So first of all, let's look at the counter goal of the negative team. It is from the U.S. Department of State, September 13th, 2013. And it says, quote, "To protect and advance U.S. interests, the United States uses all tools available, including foreign assistance, to make Bahrain a stronger and more interoperable partner for regional stability, security, and counterterrorism operations." This is the goal, overarching goal of the United States in their deals with Bahrain. Now, the goals are presented by the affirmative team. The first goal is that arms cannot contribute to human rights violations. However, this is already the case. From Kenneth Katzman from the Congressional Research Service, February 14th, 2014. It says, quote, "In a provision that appears in large part directed at U.S. arms sales policy toward Bahrain, a provision of the federal year 2014 Consolidated Appropriations Act prohibits use of U.S. funds for tear gas, small arms, light weapons, ammunition, and other items for crowd control purposes for foreign security forces that use excessive force to repress peaceful expression, association, or assembly in countries undergoing democratic transition." So what this is saying from 2014 is that we are not allowing the U.S. to sell weapons to Bahrain that they could use against their citizens. This goal is already being met in the current system without the affirmative team's plan. The next goal is that there will be increased regional stability and peace. However, there already is regional stability and peace in that area. This evidence will also go under Advantage 2, but I will read it under this goal. And it says, it is from Rob Sabahani from Washington Times, February 12, 2015. And it says, quote, "On all accounts, King Hamad, who is the king of Bahrain, has practiced good governance. And herein lies the real reason why the 4th anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring, Bahrain remains an island of stability in the midst of the ongoing chaos that continues to engulf that region. Bahrain is our stable country in the Middle East. This goal is, again, already being met in the current system." Now, moving on to the actual plan presented by the affirmative team. The biggest part of this is that we don't have the numbers for how much better this will become. We only have a small percent of 72 people. We aren't quite sure what happened to them, but there are 72 people that had their human rights violated. However, the affirmative team has offered no numbers with how much their plan will help this. Therefore, without these numbers, we cannot assume that their plan is solvent. So the first mandate presented by the affirmative team is that we will set a cap. However, I would like you to notice that this is setting a cap. It is not limiting a certain weapon. So let's say that we did sell them all the weapons, even though in the current system we don't. Let's say we sold them all weapons that could be used for human rights violations, etc. If that was the case, this plan would not be solving their first goal, because all it is doing is setting a cap without actually limiting the weapons that can be sold. Therefore, these weapons could be used to create human rights violations. Now, the second mandate is that they must be meeting or at least going towards the Universal Declaration of Rights. Now, first of all, in the last Class X, the affirmative team said that they just need to be making steps forward. So they don't need to be answering these rights, they just need to be taking steps forward. So steps forward is very broad. Therefore, until we know what they need to be reaching in this Universal Declaration of Rights, this mandate cannot solve for their advantages or help their goals. So now let's move into the advantages. The first advantage is that it will encourage human rights reform. Again, as we have already stated, the U.S. has cut arms sales that can be used for human rights violations. Again, as we have stated, their plan is not bringing this advantage about because they are not limiting the weapons that are being sold. Therefore, they could buy, if the law wasn't already in place, they could buy any weapons that dealt with human rights violations. Moving on to the second alleged advantage, and that is that peace and stability will be improved. Again, as my evidence that I read under the goal stated, Bahrain is America's island of stability in the midst of ongoing chaos that continues to engulf the region. Bahrain is stable right now. This is already in the current system. The other point under this is that there has been no impact brought up by the affirmative team of how this will help the United States when their plan is implemented. They have just said that there will be more stability, but they haven't shown the impact of how that is hurting the U.S. or how it will improve the United States in the future. Without that, this advantage is not significant. Now let's look at what is the significant part of this plan, and that is the disadvantage. The disadvantage is that it will hurt Bahrain. Now, the last affirmative speaker stated that, well, Iran probably won't attack. They don't have a great likelihood of doing that. However, this evidence is from John McCain from Al Monitor, March 25th, 2015. Quote, "I am very concerned about Iranian penetration into Bahrain. That's their next target. There are several things I'm not happy about that Bahrain's government has done, but they still need to be able to defend their country. There's no doubt that Iranian weapons are coming into Bahrain. We should give them weapons, and we should continue to pressure them to respect human rights. Both." So what Senator John McCain is saying is that we can strike this balance with the status quo. That we can continue to boost their defense by not setting a cap, while still not supporting their human rights violations. So although at face front, the affirmative team might seem like they have a good plan that will improve the stability, the security of the United States, there are no significant impacts, no significant reasons to make this change when there could be risk to Bahrain and to the United States. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination and questions of further clarification.
Good evening.
Good evening.
How many pieces of evidence did you read in your speech?
That is an excellent question. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, now of these 6 pieces of evidence, how many of them were read in the first negative constructive?
None of them.
And so absolutely none of the articles that you cited in the speech were cited in the first negative constructive.
That is correct. My partner did cite the 2014 year in the cross-ex, but none of the other evidence was cited in the one.
Okay. Now, could you please state Senator John McCain's credentials to talk about Bahrain in this situation?
Well, Senator John McCain is a senator from Arizona, and he is chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Since he is the chairman of that, I would assume that he knows what he's talking about.
Okay. Are you aware of the credentials of the Brookings Institute overall?
Yes.
Okay, could you please state maybe just a couple of credentials under
good
them?
grief. I know that I can't list them off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I do believe...
Would you state that the Brookings Institute is a very credible source?
I would not say that it's more credible than John McCain.
Okay, why exactly is John McCain more credible than the Brookings Institute?
For one reason, he is on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Therefore, he must have shown knowledge in that to do it. The Brookings Institute in itself, we would need to have the author of that evidence. I can't just say that the Brookings Institute
Now, what number specifically is the negative team looking for based around human rights violations?
We need any number. There's no number how this will get better. There's no significant numbers that it's been bad, and so...
What was the, when was the article considered met under the affirmative team's plan?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
In the first affirmative constructive, what was the measure of when an article was considered met?
I guess I missed that. If you could bring that back up, I'm sorry.
Okay. Did you bring up any evidence under the mandates at all?
No.
Or did you just refer back to evidence that was stated earlier in the speech?
No, I did not bring up any evidence under the mandates.
Okay. Now, under the counter goal, did you read any evidence besides just the goal itself in this speech related to the counter goal?
No.
Okay, so why should we believe that this counter goal is more significant than any of the affirmative team's goals?
Right, because the evidence that the counter goal is in says that it is one of the main goals that the U.S. uses when selling.
Okay, so is this goal actually a goal of the State Department?
It is.
Okay, did you just say that this is cited in an article?
It is cited in the State Department. I can try to find it for you. If you have another question, you can go ahead and ask.
No, I'm out of time.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, thank you.
As we make our policy decisions about Bahrain, we must not only balance human rights, but our strategic interests. Now, moving into the rebuttal speeches, I hope to show you why our strategic interests are important enough to not pass the affirmative team's plan as we move throughout this, the 3 arguments that we have remaining, or the 2 stock issues and the goals that we have remaining in this debate round. So we're going to rearrange the round and we're going to address 3 main points. First of all, we're going to talk about the goals. Secondly, we're going to talk about significance. And finally, we're going to talk about the stock issue of solvency. So let's start off first with the goals, and these tie into the stock issue of solvency. Does the affirmative team's plan solve these goals? So the affirmative team provided us with 2 main goals in this debate round. The first is to ensure that arms transfers do not contribute to human rights violations. Now again, this is better met in the status quo because we are not selling weapons that directly can be used in human rights violations. This is an argument my partner and I have made multiple times in this debate round. So let's look at how does the affirmative team's plan not better better meet this. It does not better meet this because it's not actually promoting significant human rights in the status quo. They're not trying to actually better them, but they're simply limiting the amount of weapons they can buy no matter what. Now let's look at the second goal provided by the affirmative team, that of regional peace and stability. Again, this is already within the status quo. Now, don't just take our word for it, but this evidence is from Rob Sapani was published in the Washington Times on February 12th, 2015. He says, quote, "At a time when America needs stable and reliable allies to counter the myriad of threats emanating from the Middle East, we are very lucky to have a friend in King Hamad, whose stewardship of Bahrain's challenges since 2011 has kept his country stable," unquote. So we see that, first of all, Bahrain is working to keep the country stable. And secondly, we're maintaining our strategic relationship with them, as we'll see later on is critically important, in order to maintain that stability. We are providing them with weapons that they can use in defense and in counterterrorism. We're trying to help them achieve the peace and stability necessary in the Middle East. Now, let's look at the counter goal. Now, this is an issue of contention since the affirmative team did not accept it, but I want to clarify for you one more time why our counter goal is important in today's debate round. This is from the U.S. Department of State's policy, and it's entitled U.S. Relations with Bahrain. This dictates their relations with Bahrain, and the U.S. Department of State not only has an impact in arms sales, but it also has an impact in our relations with other countries. So what they're doing is we're trying to make Bahrain stronger, not just in regional peace and security and human rights violations, but also in counterterrorism cooperation. These are all of our strategic interests. This is why the goal needs to be accepted by the affirmative team and needs to be considered in today's debate round. Again, this is an important goal because of where it comes from and what it does in the status quo. And it's one that's better met in the status quo because the United States meets all parts without excluding some of them. So let's move into the second issue, that of significance. Under this point, we'll be addressing briefly the advantages and then the disadvantage. The first advantage presented by the affirmative team is that the United States will encourage human rights reform. Again, they're not encouraging human rights reform in any way better than the United States is currently doing right now, because the United States is not contributing to human rights violations, and they're making their disapproval of Bahrain's practices known by withdrawing arms that can be used in that. Their second proposed advantage is that peace and stability will be improved. Again, we're not better meeting peace and security with the affirmative team's plan, because first of all, we have good peace and security, and secondly, we're reducing our impact in the region. We're withdrawing some of our arms sales. We're significantly reducing it and placing a cap, which limits some of the strategic interests that we have with Bahrain. This is placing an unconditional cap indefinitely into the future, and this cap could severely limit, especially if Bahrain needs more weapons. Now, moving into the disadvantage. In a comparative advantage case, you have to weigh, are the advantages or disadvantages more significant? Now, my partner and I firmly believe that the disadvantage is critically important when considering the affirmative team's plan in today's debate round. Let's look at this evidence from Daniel Wagner and Giorgio Caffiero, published in the Gulf State Analytics, October 7, 2014. It says, quote, "The extent to which the U.S.-Bahrain alliance has strengthened over the last 35 years has largely been driven by a mutual fear of Iran's alleged aims in the Middle East," unquote. So this shows that our policy is driven by this, and yet the affirmative team is withdrawing some of this policy and support, even in the face of this threat. This is significant. Now, the issue of solvency deals with the plan. They're setting a cap without limiting which weapons can be bought, and they're not balancing strategic interests with human rights violations. They're actually sacrificing our strategic interests in favor of human rights violations. The status quo currently maintains our stance on human rights and our strategic interests. This is what we should be sticking with for Bahrain and the United States.
George Bernard Shaw once said, "Progress is impossible without change." And this is essentially the stance of the affirmative team. By changing, we will be making progress in Bahrain, and changing their minds about human rights violations will make our vital ally Bahrain a better place. Now, before I begin going down with the stock issues, I would like to point out that the negative team had two main people supporting their arguments. They had very little evidence in their past few speeches, and so essentially there's only two people, main sources that they cited. Under the counter goal, the negative team has still not provided us with any evidence that the counter goal that they provided is better than our goals. And also, this counter goal of supporting our allies will not be lost under the affirmative team's plan, because essentially we will not lose our relationship with them, and we will still remain allies. And so now moving into solvency, the first argument is that under the goals, under solvency. And the first argument under the first goal is that this is already being met in the status quo, and that we are not contributing to human rights violations. But in fact, we are contributing to human rights violations. According to revealed America's arms sales to Bahrain amid bloody crackdown, ProPublica, Justin Elliott, January 15, 2013, Bahrain used American-made helicopters to fire on protesters in the most intense period of the crackdown. These Cobra helicopters conducted live ammunition airstrikes on protesters. And I have more recent evidence from 2015 that we are still contributing to human rights violations. Now, moving into the second goal is basically the same argument that this is already being met under the status quo. But the evidence that they read under this was the same evidence, and they did not read any new evidence supporting this argument. And under significance is the mandate and the disadvantage. Under the mandate, we are limiting the quantity of arms. What we're doing under our plan is we are giving Bahrain an incentive to reform. Once they realize that they have to reform their human rights violations in order to get their weapons back, they will want to reform and make these changes. Our case is by no means trying to make Bahrain perfect. What we're doing is setting a standard so that Bahrain will want to change. And also the evidence under significance and solvency, there was very little evidence in the last few speeches, in the last rebuttal. And according to Bahraini's demand, more than cosmetic reforms, Director of Bahrain Watch, how does Bahrain begin making reforms? It is difficult to say, but I think the solution is continued direct pressure from foreign governments. So this is the key for reform. And what we're doing, and our advantage of peace and stability will come about. And also under the second mandate, a few speeches ago, the negative team challenged the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it is a recognition of inherent dignity. This is quoting from Human Rights Resource Center. Recognition of the inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is quoted from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The influence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been substantial. Its principles have been incorporated into constitutions of more than 185 nations now in the UN. So this is saying that the influence of this is extremely significant. And also, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by 56 members of the United States, and the vote was unanimous. So this is not an issue. This should not be an issue under the affirmative team's plan. I hope I have shown you that change is necessary in Bahrain, and our vital ally will be a better place, and that our goals will be met. Thank you, and I urge for an affirmative ballot.
So judges, today we are faced with a decision. Will we keep our balance, or will we tip to one side or another? Will we risk changes to the status quo, with consequences that will hurt Bahrain, who is our ally, thereby hurting U.S. interests in that region? That is the question that we need to answer tonight. Now, before I move on, the affirmative team has continually brought up that we haven't brought up credentialed sources. I went through and I tried to find all the evidence we have brought up. Here are the authors that we have brought up. That is John McCain, John Davies, Rob Subhani, Kenneth Katzman in the Department of State. I will read one or two more in my speech today. We have indeed brought up more credentialed sources. Those were actually just from my speech, not from my partners. So in that case, we have brought up credentialed experts supporting our positions. So let's start, first of all, with the goals. The first goal of the affirmative team is that we cannot allow arms to contribute to human rights violations. As we have stated again and again, currently, they are not. We are not allowing any weapons that can be used for human rights violations to be sent. The other point under this is if we pretend like that law doesn't exist, and we just take the affirmative team's plan, their mandates, by just setting the cap and not saying what they cannot buy, do not solve this. By not saying that they can't buy human rights violations weapons, I guess you could call them, they are not able to meet this goal. The second goal, that of increasing regional stability, again, this is already being met, as we read evidence stating. Not only that, with their plan, there will be worse consequences and less stability, as we will get into with the disadvantage. Moving on to the stock issue of significance. The first point under this is the first alleged advantage. That is to encourage human right reform. First of all, as we have said, since they are not limiting what weapons they can be sold, there is no impact presented by the affirmative team that this will actually change. No impact this whole round that the negative team has asked for has been presented by the affirmative team. Until we know how big of a change this will have in Bahrain, we cannot assume that this advantage is significant, that we will truly be encouraging human right reform. The second alleged advantage is that of peace and stability will be improved. Again, as we read 2, maybe 3 pieces of evidence stating that they are the stablest country in that region for us. This is happening. Not only that, but again, no impact. No impact how this will help the United States, how this will help Bahrain. Without an impact, there's no reason to change. It's not significant enough to change. So now let's look at the stock issue of solvency. The mandates fall under, hold on, I skipped the disadvantage. Going back to the disadvantage, this is a huge part, that of hurting Bahrain. How exactly will this be hurting Bahrain? Iran is a threat. My partner and I, every speech, have read evidence saying that Iran is able to defeat Bahrain. Now, what impact does that have? That's our job to tell you. Well, if Iran were to attack Bahrain, then the Bahrainis would not have as much, they wouldn't be able to interact with us militarily or with the oil flow, etc. And if they were not able to do this, the U.S. interest would be hurt. So that is how this will be hurting Bahrain and through that the U.S. So moving now on to the stock issue of solvency. The first mandate, that of setting the cap, again, they're setting a cap without limiting weapons. So without limiting weapons, that means that they cannot claim that they will not be sending weapons that won't be adding to the human rights violations. Also, the affirmative team said that Bahrain wants reform, that they are willing and want reform. However, there is no evidence read under this point, and we need a credentialed source, as the affirmative team agrees. We need a credentialed source if they're going to claim that Bahrain wants and will reform. Under the mandate 2, that of that the Universal Declaration of Rights must be met. However, our interests in that region outweigh the helping of human rights violations. Because the human rights violations, we have not been given a significant impact again. Not only that, but our interests are of upper importance, as the counter goal says. So that is why today we need to stick with the status quo. Thank you.
So, the negative team wants to talk about impacts. Let's look at how few of the negative team's arguments have actually been impacted. Now, the counter goal, the biggest issue here is that the counter goal. The negative team has still yet to bring up evidence showing why the counter goal is more important by the affirmative team's plan. And in none of these speeches has this been brought up. And this is why the affirmative team, in this last speech, still refuses to accept this counter goal. But as my partner stated, this would not be lost. This would still be met under the affirmative team's plan. Now, it is still unclear to the affirmative team why the negative team chose to group the goals separate from the other stock issues. But as you, the judges, cannot vote specifically on goals, I'm going to place the goals under the stock issue of solvency and argue them there from here on out. We'll first begin with the stock issue of significance. Now, under here lie the disadvantages and the goals. And the the negative team has stated that these goals would not be significantly met by the affirmative team. They keep claiming the affirmative team has not brought up numbers of how much this will be benefited. However, if we look at the one specific case, all the way back in the first affirmative constructive, in order for it to be considered met, there must be less than 10 violations per year. And as evidence stated in the second affirmative constructive, in one instance, at one trial, 72 people had their citizenship revoked. Now, if Bahrain wanted to qualify under the affirmative team's plan, then technically, for that specific article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they could have only outlawed 10 citizens, and 62 people would still be citizens in that country. This is just one example of many more issues in Bahrain that would be helped under the affirmative team's plan. Now, the other issue under the disadvantage. Now, here under the disadvantage, we see that there's still no evidence brought up by the negative team showing why this disadvantage will come specifically from stopping conventional arms sales to Bahrain. They've simply stated that this is a bad thing, while also conveniently not addressing any of the evidence brought up by the affirmative team that shows that the Fifth Fleet helps defend Bahrain from Iran, and the lack of evidence stated by the Brookings Institute of that Iran actually wishes to invade Bahrain. Under the second goal / advantage of the affirmative team's plan of the increased stability, the negative team keeps wanting the affirmative team to bring up evidence, but they've still never linked the two issues of not having stability and the affirmative team's plan. So we'll move into the last issue of solvency. Now, I moved the goals under here, and these goals will be met under the affirmative team's plan. To this point in these speeches, the negative team has still never addressed the evidence brought up by the affirmative team that 90% of the arms are still being contributed to to the organization that commits these human rights violations. We are directly giving arms to this organization. We are not withholding these arms sales, as the negative team wishes to claim. And the more recent evidence by the affirmative team's evidence should show why this is important. Continuing under the theme of the goals and advantages of the point of stability, and the stability will be improved, as stated multiple times through evidence in the affirmative team's speeches. We see that in order for stability to actually be improved, we need genuine reform, and that is something that the affirmative team's plan will bring about. The negative team still is making an issue of the fact that under the affirmative team's plan, Bahrain could still buy weapons to violate human rights with. But if they bought those weapons to violate human rights, that means that they would get less money in the next year, as was stated in the first affirmative constructive. And in addition, because of this limited amount of money, Bahrain would have to be kind of careful about what they actually bought. If they're still violating 7, they'd only have $20 million to spend. Finally, under solvency, we really see, does the negative team's counter goal and disadvantage actually outweigh the advantages? That's what the negative team has basically stated that this comes down to. And we see in the negative team speeches no evidence that the disadvantage comes specifically from stopping arms sales to Bahrain, or that this counter goal will not be met under the affirmative team's plan. While on the affirmative team side, we've shown through multiple pieces of evidence how Bahrain's human rights will be improved, how stability will be improved as a result of these human rights abuses. For all of these reasons, I urge that we reform our policy to Bahrain.